Let me start by asking you a question. So, if you can choose to be a superhero, any superhero, who would you want to be? It's a very common question that you might hear in like icebreaker games and whatnot. But if you can be a superhero, and it seems like these days there's no shortage of superhero movies out there these days, um, who would you want to be? If I were asked that question, I would probably have to go with the classic, Superman. Because let's face it, there are a lot of so-called superheroes that are not really actually superheroes. Like for example, Batman. He's just a rich guy who has lots of cool gadgets that makes him, you know, able to do a lot of things. Same with Iron Man, right? Smart guy, lots of money. But when it comes to actually being a superhero with like superhuman powers, I don't think there's anyone you can kind of uh, top Superman with his like ability to fly and superhuman strength, of course, and he has X-ray vision and he can shoot lasers from his eyes, and there's like nothing he can't do. It seems like. Now, if there was a superhero in the Bible, of course, it would have to be the guy that we're talking about today, Samson, who also happens to be one of the last judges of Israel. And if you remember last week's message that Pastor John shared about Gideon, you can see that there's really a stark contrast between Gideon and Samson. So if you remember, Gideon was this very timid, and you can almost say he was a humble guy. He kind of saw himself as being the least in his father's house, from the weakest clan in Manasseh. And he was very, very timid. He was not very eager to go out and fight, right? He had to test God several times to just make sure that God was actually with him. But when we read the story of Samson, we can see that Samson's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. He's full of confidence. He's kind of brazen with his actions. He would just kind of do things at the spur of the moment. And he seems to be this very proud and very self-confident kind of guy. And if you think about it, given the fact that he has this incredible strength, this superhuman strength, you can't really blame the guy for being proud and confident, right? He's like the classic jock, if you will, in the high school, right? He knew that he was the strongest man in the hood, and he knew that he had something special that he was not afraid to let others know about. But before we go on, let's back up a little and start by looking at Samson's kind of background, his upbringing. So if you actually go back to the beginning of the story, you see that Samson was from the tribe of Dan, and his father, whose name was Manoah, and his wife, who is interestingly enough not really actually named in the story, so we just know her as Manoah's wife. We see this couple, and they are not able to have a child, and so they want to have kids, but they can't. And one day, Manoah's wife is visited by an angel, and is told that she would have a son, and that her son would, and this is what the angel tells her, that her son would begin to save Israel from the hands of the Philistines, because at this time, it's another cycle that you see in the book of Judges where the Israelites, once again, they rebel, they disobey God, and now this time they're being punished through the Philistines, who are oppressing them, who have taken over the Israelites, and they are suffering under the hands of the Philistines. And so Manoah's wife, Samson's mom, is told that her child is going to start to save Israel from the Philistines. She's also told that the child is to be raised as a Nazarite. And to get a kind of a detailed explanation of what a Nazarite is, you can read Numbers chapter 6, where God gives a detailed instructions to the Israelites of how, as an Israelite, you can actually choose, you can decide to make a special vow where you are going to consecrate or separate yourself for the Lord for a set period of time. So usually this was not for the for a person's entire lifetime, but for a specific set of time, maybe for a few months, maybe for a year, for a special occasion. And there were some very strict regulations in terms of what were the things that you were not allowed to do as a Nazarite. So for example, a Nazarite was not allowed to drink wine. In fact, they were not allowed to touch anything that came from the vine, grapes, right? So you can't eat grapes, you can't eat grape juice, you can't eat raisins. So nothing that is from the grape they were allowed to have. And they were also forbidden to go near a dead body. So they couldn't touch a dead body, they couldn't go near it. In fact, in Numbers chapter 6, specifically instructs the Nazarites that they can't even go to their own parents or their family's funeral. Right? So if their brother or sister or their parents died, they were not even allowed to be in the room with the dead body. And lastly, they were not allowed to cut their hair. And God tells them, if you're going to be a Nazarite, you're not supposed to put a razor to your head. You have to grow your hair long for the duration of the time that you are devoting yourself as a Nazarite. And so Samson was a special case because unlike, the typical situation where a person would declare that, yes, I want to be a Nazarite, and that would only be for a set period of time, Samson was to be devoted as a Nazarite from birth for an indefinite period of time. So that was the prophecy or the message that was received by Samson's mom. And eventually, lo and behold, just as the angel had told her, she has a child, she has a son, names him Samson. And at the end of Judges chapter 13, it says, the young man grew, so Samson grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. So it seems like everything's going great. God sends a promised deliverer who is going to start rescuing the Israelites from their oppressors. The baby is born, the baby is growing up, God's blessing the child, and the Spirit of God is with the child, with this young man. But when you go to chapter 14, you can see that things start to go wrong, very wrong. First, right away, we see that Samson wants to marry a Philistine woman. Right? We see how he sees this, I guess, beautiful woman in his eyes and tells his parents that, hey, go get her as my wife. Now, if you read the chapter, you see that his parents try to talk Samson out of it by asking, hey, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives? Don't you have like women in our immediate family, in our relatives, or amongst our people that you have to go and take a wife from these uncircumcised Philistines? Like you're supposed to deliver us from these people, but now you want to marry the person that you're supposed to deliver us from? And they try to talk him out of it, but Samson simply replies, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. In my eyes, she's right. In my eyes, she's the right one. In my opinion, I think this is the right woman. And so Samson goes and gets married to this Philistine woman. Another problem that we start to see is that it appears that Samson does not take his Nazirite vow seriously. There are lots of examples where he blatantly breaks the conditions of his vow. For example, in the passage that we read today, there is this little interesting story of how Samson kills a lion with his hand, which is pretty cool. And then a few days later, when he goes back to check on the carcass, he notices that there is a hive of bees that have nested in the dead carcass. I guess that's what bees do. And there's honey in the lion. And now, of course, as a Nazarite, you remember that Samson was not even supposed to go near a dead body, let alone touch it. But what does Samson do? He goes to the lion, he scoops the honey from the lion, he starts to eat the honey, he even gives it to his parents, and he totally violates the commandment to not touch a dead body. Also, it's interesting to note that he travels with his parents to the vineyards in Timnah on his way to get married. And of course, it doesn't mean necessarily that he would have eaten grapes or drank wine, but the fact that he even goes to the vineyard where there would be lots of grapes, when he knew as a Nazarite that he's not supposed to eat anything that comes from the grape, is interesting, and makes you wonder whether or not he even broke that vow and maybe enjoyed some wine, especially during his wedding party. And of course, we know at the very end of the story, he even allows his hair to be shaved off when he tells Delilah the secret to his strength. Furthermore, on top of the fact that he kind of has contempt for his Nazirite vow, we see that Samson was more interested in using his God-given superhuman strength for his petty revenge and personal vendetta. For example, when Samson loses a bet with his wedding party, so there's again a very interesting story where during the wedding party, he poses a riddle based on his encounter with the lion to his guests, the 30 men that were there in his wedding party. And he says, hey, if you don't get the answer, if you don't solve the riddle, then you have to give me 30 pieces of clothing, garment. But if you guess it right, then I will give each of you robes, garments, clothing, right? And so they have 7 days to figure it out. And of course, they have no idea what the answer to the riddle is. And so these people, they go to Samson's wife and says to her, hey, did you invite us to rob us? You gotta tell us, you gotta go to your husband, figure out what the answer is and tell us the answer, or else we're actually going to burn down your house. And so Samson's wife goes to Samson, pleads with him and says, please, you gotta tell me what the answer is. You're gonna literally kill me. So Samson finally relents, tells her the answer is a lion. And she goes and tells the man, and the man tells Samson the answer. And Samson, of course, is furious because he figures out that the only reason they knew the answer is because his wife told him. And so out of anger, he goes out and he actually goes to a city, strikes down 30 people, takes their clothes, their robes, their garments, and then gives it to the men at the wedding party. So another example of Samson just using his God-given strength just to vent out his anger, to lash out, and for taking personal vengeance. And then you can also read about the story of Samson tying, I think it was like 300 foxes together, tail to tail, setting fields on fire, striking down people with the jawbone, all either because he was angry or he was just trying to take vengeance for some personal injury that he received from the Philistines. So, to say the least, Samson was really not the ideal judge. Now, if you look at the life of Samson, in many ways, he perfectly embodies the nation of Israel as a whole. He's almost like a representative of what the Israelites as a nation what they were doing in terms of their relationship with God. For example, just like how Israel was chosen out of the nations by God, Samson was chosen to be separate unto him. Just as how the Israelites were given the laws and the commandments to follow on Mount Sinai, Samson was given a set of rules that he ought to follow as a Nazarite. There were a set of laws and rules that he had to follow. And just as God's presence dwelt among the Israelites in the tabernacle, the Spirit of God was with Samson. However, just as the Israelites failed to drive out all the Canaanites when they entered the Promised Land and even started to intermarry with them, Samson also falls in love with Philistine women. Just as the Israelites are described during the time of Judges as doing what was right in their own eyes, Samson also does what is right in his eyes. And just as the nation of Israel was handed over to their enemies as a consequence of their disobedience and sin, Samson is eventually handed over to the Philistines and enslaved. Just as the Israelites who failed miserably, Samson also fails as the deliverer chosen by God. But you see, where Samson failed, there would be another deliverer chosen by God hundreds of years later. And it's very interesting that just like Samson, this deliverer's birth would also be foretold by an angel to a woman who was also unlikely to have a child. And while Samson's parents were told that their child will begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines, this child's parents will be told that he will save his people from their sins. While Samson was proud, this new deliverer would be humble and obedient. And just as Samson was betrayed by someone close to him for pieces of silver, this new deliverer will also be betrayed and handed over to his enemies in exchange for silver. Just as Samson was publicly mocked and humiliated, this new deliverer would also be mocked and ridiculed. When Samson died, he put to death about 3,000 Philistines. But when this new deliverer dies on the cross, he would put to death death itself and rise again from the grave. Where Samson failed, Jesus prevailed. And this, brothers and sisters, is the gospel message. And this is what the story of Samson is pointing towards. The good news of Christ, where we fall like Samson, Christ prevails. Because when I think about it, when I think about myself, just as Samson was chosen and set apart by God, I have been chosen by God. We have been chosen. As it says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. But just as Samson succumbed to the desires of his eyes, we also often succumb to the desires of the flesh, the desires of our eyes. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, it tells us, for all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And how often do we allow the things of this world to take our attention, to cause us to stumble, to be led astray? Samson was gifted. He was given an incredible gift, but he misused it. He used it for his own purpose, for his own personal gain. And likewise, how often do we take advantage of the gifts and the blessings that God has given to us for our own desires and goals. And perhaps just like Samson, we too find ourselves neglecting the mission, the task that we have been given, that we have been entrusted with, as we are too busy chasing after other things in the world. Because we're too busy seeing things in this world that pleases our eyes. So let me ask all of us as I wrap up. What are the special gifts and abilities that God has given you? It may not be superhuman strength like Samson, but we all have been given unique gifts and talents by God. We all have been given spiritual gifts. We all have been given incredible blessings living in Canada, living in this place, given the opportunities that we have. How are you using these gifts to participate in God's great redemptive story? Samson was given his superhuman strength in order to be part of God's redemptive plan for Israel, to rescue them from the Philistines. Likewise, we are given our unique gifts to be part of God's redemptive plan for all humanity. We have been invited to participate in this grand narrative of God's redemption of this world. And he has given us unique gifts so that we can take part in this great plan. And so how are we using these gifts to participate in God's redemptive story? What are the things that our eyes see as being good? Being good. That is distracting us or preventing us from participating in God's redemptive plan. We live in a world that has so many things that our eyes can see. Thanks to the internet and the devices that we have in our hands, there is literally no limit to what we can see with our eyes. What are the things that are right in your eyes that you are chasing after in your life? What are the distractions? What are the flashy things that are taking you away from the task that we have been entrusted with? How can we make sure that we are not allowing God's good gifts from making us proud, that we are not misusing these gifts, that we're not being distracted by the things that are around us? I believe the answer is looking at the cross. Let us look to the cross. When we look at the cross, when we fix our eyes on Christ, I believe that it will strip away our pride when we see our sins nailed with Jesus on the cross. When we see the cross, when we fix our eyes on our Savior, I believe that we will be able to refocus our minds, our thoughts on this incredibly important and the eternal worth in terms of having valued this plan, the redemptive plan that God has entrusted us with. And I believe that when we fix our eyes on the cross, that we would once again be able to commit our lives to God and live a life that is separated, that is consecrated for Him. And I want to end my message today by sharing with you the words of the famous hymn by Isaac Watts that I believe just says it beautifully, the reason why we need to look at the cross. And so let me read for you the words from When I Survey. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. See, from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown? Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all.